Hi, Misha here, and as promised, getting back to the British Hawker Siddeley Harrier. In a previous video, we looked at this one here, the C Harrier. This is an FA2 from the 1990s, one of the newer versions. Obviously, this is based for the Royal Navy, developed in the late 70s and came in service just in time for the Falklands War. But today, we're really going to talk about the American AV8 Harrier. And to do that, we also have to talk about the Royal Air Force's Harrier, the GR1 through GR9. Here on the stand we have an AV8C. This was once a US Marines Harrier, later transferred to NASA. And we also have an AV8B of the Marines. This model and the C Harrier are from Hobbymaster, and this one is from Corgi. All three are 1/72 scale diecast. Well, I will do my best to condense this video because there's a lot to get through. Harrier. Well, going all the way back to the 1950s, late 50s, the Hawker Company was looking to replace, the next project after the Hunter. And the British government was considering kind of cutting back on manned aircraft, maybe going more to missiles and things. At the same time, there was quite a bit of interest in either vertical takeoff and landing or short takeoff and landing aircraft, as helicopters were becoming more and more common at this point. So really, the engine, the Pegasus engine that the Harrier uses, was developed before or alongside the Harrier airframe. And the original P1127 Hawker prototype was on the drawing board by 1959. 1960, the British government asked for a couple of prototypes, and that resulted in some early test models. They were just kind of proof of concept. They did have some tests of the engines and even some kind of limited test flying in October of that year. After that, the U.S. military, specifically the Marines, became interested, as did many others in NATO. And at this point, the project kind of splits. Some, like the British, wanted a subsonic ground attack, close air support, light fighter, whereas others in NATO wanted a supersonic vertical takeoff and landing fighter. Well, that really didn't go much of anywhere. That was Project 1154. By 1965, it was canceled because trying to do a vertical takeoff and landing supersonic craft at that day and time, it just wasn't practical. Even today with the F-35B, it was barely managed. But the subsonic continued. The next prototype was the Hawker Siddeley Kestrel, which first flew in 1964. They would end up making about 9 prototypes of it, and it impressed a lot of people. Was used at air shows. It would directly lead to the British government signing a contract in 1966. In 1967, the updated, improved Hawker Siddeley Harrier prototype first flew. And soon, the first of 60 initially ordered would be delivered in early 1969, and the plane would be adopted in 1969 in April of that year, and quickly go into service. The British would station 2, then 3 squadrons of these in West Germany as a deterrent against a potential Soviet invasion through the Fulda Gap. These would also see use in the Falklands War. And that would be pretty much the end of the combat for the first generation. There's the GR1, GR3, and GR5 are all considered earlier Harriers. Really, most of the updates were just to the Pegasus engine to get more power. They would also, of course, update avionics, so on and so forth. Well, where did the AV8 arise from? Well, as I said in a few other previous American videos, the U.S. Marines were not really impressed with the attack aircraft on offer from America in the late 60s. So they went their own way. Having been interested in closely following the whole Harrier program for years, in 1969 they agreed to purchase 110 Harriers from the UK. Originally, it was considered producing them in the US by McDonald-Douglas under license, but politics and other things got in the way. So these would be produced by British Aerospace, who had taken over. Well, really, Hawker Siddeley had merged into it. But, yeah, so the first generation of U.S. Marines Harriers would be made in Britain. They would be designated as the AV8A. Early production ones would be analogous to the GR1, but soon they would be updated with the better engine of the GR3. And between 1971 and 1976, the contract would be fulfilled. Of the 110, 102 were the single seat, and 8 were the 2-seat trainer. However, very early on, 1973, a joint project would begin that would lead to this plane, the upgraded AV8B, which we'll get to in just a moment. But that gets me back to why this is an AV8C. In 1979, an upgrade program was commenced by the U.S. Marine Corps, wherein they would extend the service life of their existing AV8 fleet, basically going through the airframe, strengthening this, replacing that, refurbishing essentially. They would also take the opportunity to introduce some of the research and updates from the, as it was called, the Harrier II program that was ongoing at the time. So essentially the AV8C was just a slightly updated, slightly modernized AV8A that was given a fresh coat of paint and some engine boost and so on and so forth. Kind of a interim solution. The first generation mostly were converted, but a few were still left as A's. But either way, the AV8A and AV8C fleet would be retired from active Marine service in 1987. And that's actually when this plane here, in 1988, would have been transferred to NASA. Kind of neat. Of course, the Harrier's big claim to fame is it's capable of a short takeoff and landing, and that's fully armed up. Or, if you reduce the fuel and weapons load a bit, it can do a vertical takeoff and landing. This was always good for operating at forward bases, where there were very crude airfields or none at all. They could just launch from like a platform. It was also very advantageous to the British Navy, who started operating their Invincible class cruisers, because politics at the time didn't like to have carriers, so they were cruisers, but they didn't have full carriers anymore to operate full-sized planes from. So they actually used what they called a ski jump ramp to launch these. But again, more for that, you can check out my video on the British Navy planes. Well, why don't we move on to the second generation of Harriers? Alright. One of the big hang-ups about the Harrier that was never fully resolved, and is really a problem with VTOL aircraft in general, is the engine, the power plant. The Pegasus used in the Harrier is a very interesting engine. It doesn't have a traditional rear. It has vectorable nozzles, 4, 2 on each side, with the intakes in the front. And when you look at the British planes, especially from the GR1 to the GR5, the biggest updates were going to more power in the engine. So as early as 1973, a program was initiated between McDonald-Douglas and the Hawker Siddeley division to make the Harrier II, the second generation. And the first thing was to get a more powerful engine built. Unfortunately, what they came up with was bigger, and it would have required a whole new fuselage and all that. Then in 1975, because of government budget cuts, Britain was forced to back out of the agreement, leaving America to go it alone. Well, this was right after Vietnam, and so defense spending was limited, so the project was canned. But development continued for a time independently in Britain at Hawker Siddeley's, British Aerospace, and McDonald-Douglas. And they were trying things like making a new wing, just things they could do to improve the plane's performance. Well, in 1976, after the Marines protested, so on and so forth, the project was allowed to move forward again. Prototypes of the new design were created. And what was known at the time as the AV8B was flown first in 1978 and then again in 1979, a second prototype. And then in 1981, the Department of Defense cleared the budget for over 300 to be ordered by the Marines, much to the Navy's argument. They didn't want the Marines to have their own plane. The Navy didn't have any use for the Harrier. Instead, they wanted the Marines to adopt the F-18 Hornet, which at the time was just the F-18. So on and so forth. But the Marines prevailed, and the first AV8Bs were ready in late 1983, and the system became operational after extensive testing in 1984. It became operational in 1985. Something else very critical, and really would help the project move forward. In 1981, Britain re-entered the program, but not as a partner as before. Instead, they were a subcontractor. This meant that America would foot the bill for development, but on the other hand, Britain had less of a say-so, and the costs were distributed differently. This would lead to the Harrier II, the second generation in Britain, the GR7 and the GR9. So what did they come up with? Really, it was a pretty radical redesign. Lengthwise, our original Harriers were 46 to 47 feet, depending on the variant. Well, so was the Harrier II. But the original wing was 25 feet long. The new one was 30. So better wing for better aerodynamics. It also had 2 additional hard points, 1 under each wing, for a total of 6 on the wings instead of 4 before. Plus there's still hard points under the fuselage. Speed was about the same. A little bit slower with the new one, but not by enough. But the range and lift capability was definitely enhanced. They also enhanced the cockpit. They went to more of a bubble style that was a little bit higher set to give the pilot a better view. Of course, they also improved the avionics, the engine, the fuel efficiency. They also went to a lot of composite carbon fiber in this to both save on weight and ease manufacturing. A 25mm cannon was standard. The Marines AV8B could carry air-to-air missiles as well as air-to-ground, like the GR series in Britain. It was primarily used to support the troops, close air support, ground attack, but it did have more of an air-to-air offensive capability than the British planes at the time. In 1987, they were already working on improved versions. For example, they worked on a version for night operations that had night vision. They would work on later versions to have access to laser-guided munitions, other updates, electronics, avionics. This would lead to the AV8B Plus. The Harrier was first stationed in the Gulf in 1990 and entered the Gulf War Operation Desert Storm in January of 1991. Basically what they would do, they would have these ready to go, and if a call for support, for help was given, then the Harriers would quickly jump into action and fly over and help out. Therefore, these were very popular with the troops because of their quick response. Because of their STOL capability, they could be stationed very close to the front. They could operate off of small maritime vessels. In fact, during the Falklands War, the British even converted some basically civilian cargo ships to house some Harriers. Just a very flexible plane. The flip side was these had pretty limited time on station, 15-20 minutes at most, because of the limited fuel and all of that. Still yet, they were very popular, and they had a very good success rate in the Gulf War, and they were praised by General Schwarzkopf at the time. Later, they would be given the Lightning Pod, which only increased their flexibility and usability. And most of the AV8Bs were upgraded to the AV8B+, plus some new planes were delivered. The last brand new Harrier was received in 1998, with the last upgrade being returned to the Marines in 2003. And that was pretty much the end of production, but definitely not the end of service. The AV8 was very quickly on the scene in 2001 in Afghanistan, and of course in 2003 again was used in Iraq, and has pretty much appeared everywhere the Marines have appeared since then. It was used in 2011 in Libya, and is still in service today, although it has started to be replaced by the F-35 Lightning. Originally, it was thought that these would stay in service until 2030, but now the planned complete retirement in America is 2025. Both British Aerospace and McDonnell-Douglas have tried over the years many ways to update and modernize the design, and to a great extent they were very successful. But just, it does date back all the way to the late 1950s, and at some point it's all you can do. So the fact that it's remained a modern, relevant plane for as long as it has is a testament to its design. It was the only vertical short takeoff landing craft of its generation to be successful. In fact, about 825 Harriers of all versions, British and American, were produced. So not an insignificant number for a specialized craft like this. And as I said a bit ago, look at the Lockheed F-35B Lightning. That has not been an easy development. It is supersonic, whereas this is subsonic. The American versions would do about 700 miles per hour with the heavier loading. The British versions could do a little better, about 730, but then again they were lighter loaded and they had a more limited range. So, can't have everything. It's an interesting aircraft from the pilot's point of view. It is challenging like a helicopter to fly, but at the same time it seems like once pilots got proficient with it, they enjoyed flying it. Yes, it had a higher than some planes' accident rating, but it was still lower than others. For example, the A4 had a higher accident rating than the AV8. So everything's relative. It was just one of those planes you had to accept the shortcomings along with its benefits, and it did have a lot of benefits. There's a lot more I could say, but some of you probably know more about this than I do anyway, and for those who don't, there are entire books out there on the Harrier. But all in all, a very successful aircraft for the Royal Navy, Royal Air Force, and U.S. Marines. And a thorn in the side of the U.S. Navy. I guess then the Navy kind of knew how the Air Force had felt when they had to adopt Navy planes like the A7, huh? Well, let's wrap up by talking about the models. This is one of the older ones. This is a Hobbymaster from a few years ago. This Corgi is also an older model. It's one of the few models of an AV8A or AV8C I could find. Most models out there are of the B. And this one actually just came out this year. It's also from Hobbymaster. And you can really see where they learned some lessons with this mold versus this one. I like this plane. Don't let me give you the impression I don't. But it has some things that bug me. Like a lot of earlier Hobbymasters, when you have it on the stand, you can't have everything on the plane. For example, I can't have the little pods under the fuselage. It looks like there almost is a way to get it on with the stand, but I never have been able to quite figure it out. Also, the cockpit fits very loose. And most annoyingly, the missiles on the outer pylons have a tiny little peg. And so they go into a tiny little hole, and very quickly that peg wore out and they started falling off on me. So I just took a little dab of glue and just, I can still pull them off if I had to, but I basically had to kind of lightly glue them in or they wouldn't stay. That said, it's still a solid construction with the detail you expect from Hobbymaster. But with the newer model here of the FA2, the ordnance stays on a lot better. It uses a different stand, more secure. The cockpit is very tight on this one. So I think they kind of figured they had a few issues and they reworked it. They have another Sea Harrier coming out very soon, and then they're going to do a GR7 or a GR9 of the RAF later in the year. So that's pretty neat. The Corgi, a little different. Like I said, it's an older Corgi. Again, it's of the NASA livery. I don't believe the cockpit opens, but it does have a pilot. And it comes with the fuel tanks already installed. Of course, no weapons. What I really like about the Corgi here, the 4 vectored nozzles are actually geared all together. So if you rotate one, all 4 rotate in synchrony, in unison. Small thing, but that's neat. The Hobbymaster, either one, each nozzle is independent, so you have to rotate all 4. Now the AV8B does have the enlarged front nozzles, which are correct. And the Sea Harrier still has the original style kind of round nozzles in the front. So I'd have to say overall, just for flexibility, this is probably the best one, because you can put the ordnance on and off, the cockpit opens, good detail level. But there are things about the Corgi that I really also like. It's a very solid feeling model. Still good detail, just not as much options. It does come with landing gear, which is nice. Leaving this one, of the 3, probably my least favorite. Not surprising since it's an older model. Just a few tweaks, and I might try a little customization on the thing where I can have the bottom pods on and still have it on the stand. But, yeah. I've been meaning to do an overview of the ground-based Harriers. Like I said, these were all used for ground attack, close support. Unlike the Navy, which was more defense, fleet defense and air-to-air. And again, there were many other versions and upgrades to the AV8B system over the years. Anyway, folks, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did and haven't already, check out some of my other videos on American planes. I've got one on the attack series, A4, A5, A6, A7. Or I've got a series on British jets, from the Electric Lightning, we go all the way back to the Meteor, and all the way forward to the Eurofighter Typhoon. I even look a bit at the F-35 Lightning. Politics aside. Any questions or comments, please do post them below. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. As always, I greatly appreciate it, and I'll catch you very soon next time.